How far would you go if someone in authority calmly told you to hurt a stranger? Not force you, just told you. Most people answer instantly, I would refuse. Almost everyone believes that about themselves. But in 1961, one of the most famous experiments in psychology put that belief to the test with ordinary, decent people. And about 2/3 of them went all the way to the end. Here's the part that should bother you. The people in that experiment weren't cruel, and they weren't broken. They were teachers, salesmen, engineers, the kind of people you pass on the street every day. Many of them sweated, trembled, even begged to stop. And then they kept going anyway. Understanding why they kept going might be the most important thing psychology has ever discovered about obedience. The timing wasn't an accident. In 1961, the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the chief organizers of the Holocaust, had just begun in Jerusalem. The world was asking the same question, over and over. How do ordinary people participate in something monstrous? Philosopher Hannah Arendt, covering that same trial, was struck by how unremarkable Eichmann seemed. Not a raging fanatic, but a careful, obedient bureaucrat. She would later call it the banality of evil. A young psychologist at Yale, named Stanley Milgram, suspected the answer wasn't about monsters at all. He suspected it was about authority itself. So he designed an experiment to measure exactly how far a normal person would go, simply because someone in charge told them to. The setup looked innocent. Volunteers answered a newspaper ad for a study on memory and learning, paid a few dollars for 1 hour. Each volunteer was assigned the role of teacher, while another man, secretly an actor, became the learner. The learner was strapped into a chair in the next room, with electrodes on his wrist. The two men drew slips of paper to decide the roles, but the draw was rigged. The volunteer always became the teacher. The teacher sat in front of a shock generator, a machine with 30 switches, starting at 15 volts and climbing step by step all the way to 450. Before starting, each teacher received a real 45-volt shock themselves, just to feel that the machine was genuine. The labels under the final switches didn't show numbers. They simply read danger, severe shock, and then 3 X marks. Every time the learner answered a question wrong, the teacher was ordered to deliver a shock, one level higher than the last. The shocks weren't real, but the teacher didn't know that. As the voltage climbed, the actor followed a script, grunts at first, then shouts, then pounding on the wall, complaining about his heart, and screaming to be released. And then, at the highest levels, nothing, total silence. If the teacher hesitated, the experimenter, a calm man in a gray lab coat, said only 4 things. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. Before the experiment, Milgram asked psychiatrists to predict the results. They estimated that only around 1 in 1,000 people, a rare sadist, would go all the way to 450 volts. The actual number was 65%. 26 out of the first 40 participants pushed the final switch, past the screaming, past the silence. And every single one of them, without exception, continued past 300 volts. The psychiatrists weren't just wrong. They were wrong by more than 600-fold. And these weren't people obeying comfortably. Recordings show participants laughing nervously, digging fingernails into their own skin, and asking again and again whether the learner was all right. Distress, it turned out, was not the same thing as disobedience. So what actually happened in that room? The first mechanism is the staircase. Nobody was asked to deliver 450 volts. They were asked to deliver 15, then 30, then 45. Each step was tiny, almost identical to the one before it. Refusing at step 20 means admitting that step 19 was also wrong. Psychologists call this gradual escalation, and it's the same mechanism that pulls people into debt, into cover-ups, and into relationships they can't explain to their friends. There was never one big decision to be evil. There were 150 tiny decisions to not stop yet. But here's where it gets darker, because the staircase only explains why stopping was hard. It doesn't explain who they believed was responsible. That was the second mechanism, and Milgram considered it the heart of the whole experiment. When participants asked, "Who is responsible if that man is hurt?" The experimenter answered, "I am responsible." And that sentence changed everything. Milgram called it the agentic state, the psychological shift where you stop seeing yourself as a person making choices and start seeing yourself as an instrument carrying out someone else's. The hands were theirs. The decision, they felt, belonged to the man in the lab coat. People didn't lose their morality. They handed it to someone else for safekeeping. Milgram noticed that many participants suddenly became meticulous about the procedure itself, reading the word pairs with perfect care, as if precision could stand in for conscience. When the self shrinks into a role, the role's small rules become easier to face than the decision's large ones. And the lab coat itself was doing quiet work the entire time. The experiment ran at Yale, inside a serious laboratory, run by a serious man with a clipboard, and every one of those details functioned as a signal. This is legitimate. Someone competent is in charge. When Milgram moved the same experiment to a shabby office in a nearby city, with no university name attached, obedience dropped noticeably. Same shocks, same screams, different costume, a meaningful share of human obedience. It turns out, responds to set design. What I'm about to tell you next is the part of this experiment almost nobody talks about, and it's the most hopeful part. Milgram ran more than a dozen variations, and they reveal exactly where obedience breaks. When the learner was moved into the same room, obedience fell. When the teacher had to press the learner's hand onto a plate, it fell further. When the experimenter gave orders by phone, instead of in person, it collapsed, and people even lied, pretending to deliver shocks they were skipping. But the most powerful variation was this. When two other teachers, secretly actors, refused to continue, obedience crashed to 10%. One dissenting voice in the room gave almost everyone else permission to stop. And in case you're hoping this was all just the 1960s, a modern replication in 2009 found nearly identical rates, and a European replication in 2017 found even higher ones. This pattern isn't locked inside laboratories, either. In 1966, researchers had an unknown doctor phone real hospital nurses and order a dangerous overdose of an unauthorized drug. 21 out of 22 nurses started preparing the dose and had to be stopped on their way to the patient's room. Every safeguard they knew gave way to a confident voice with a title. The same mechanism runs through workplaces, armies, and corporations. Wherever the sentence, "I was just doing what I was told," feels like it settles a matter. History's darkest offense, offered at Nuremberg and at Eichmann's own trial, was exactly this sentence. Milgram's experiment didn't excuse it. It explained why it comes so easily. So how do you protect yourself from something this deep? Start by learning to notice the handoff. The exact moment responsibility slides off your shoulders and onto a boss, a system, or a procedure is the moment you're most dangerous. There's a simple language trick that helps. Replace "I had to" with "I chose to," and see if the sentence still feels true. If saying "I chose" this makes you flinch, your conscience is telling you who actually owns the decision. Second, learn to see legitimacy cues for what they are. Titles, uniforms, letterheads, official processes, these things signal authority. But they don't guarantee that the authority is right. The nurses in that hospital study weren't obeying a doctor. They were obeying a voice that sounded like one. Before complying with something that feels wrong, ask one question. If this exact instruction came from someone without the title, would I still do it? Third, remember the most reliable finding in the entire experiment. One visible refusal freed almost everyone. You don't need to be a hero to change a room. You only need to be first. And the arithmetic of the staircase means the cheapest place to refuse is early. Every step you take makes the next refusal more expensive. If something feels wrong at step 3, that feeling is not an overreaction. It's the last easy exit. None of this means obedience is evil. Societies run on people doing their jobs, following laws, and trusting expertise. Most of the time, that trust is exactly right. Milgram himself was careful on this point. The same wiring that produces atrocity under a bad authority produces hospitals, fire departments, and rescue operations under a good one. The skill isn't rebellion. The skill is keeping ownership of your own actions while you cooperate. so that if the instructions ever cross a line, the person holding the brake is still you. Now you know what Milgram actually proved. Not that people are secretly cruel, but that responsibility can be quietly handed away, 15 volts at a time. The dark truth is, authority doesn't need to force you. It only needs you to stop feeling like the one deciding. Subscribe, because the next video goes even deeper.